Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us in this Pre-Tana Multi-Stakeholders Forum on Human and Drug Trafficking in Africa, Unlocking Human Freedom. We will now start the forum, and I would like to call on Ms. Letty Tembolongwe, Interim Director of African Peace and Security Program and Head of Tana Forum Secretariat. She will be joining us online. Letty, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Interim Director for the African Peace and Security Program, as well as the Tana Forum head here at IPSS. Welcome to today's Pre-Tana Forum. Indeed, all protocols are hereby observed. Today, we are partnering with Humanity United on the topic Human and Drug Trafficking and Unlocking Human Freedom. The Tana Forum theme this year is on managing security threats and building resilience for the Africa that we want. Today's topic falls under this overarching theme. Drug and human trafficking is not only an African problem, but it is a global one. The reason why we're discussing it today, as in other forums, is that we urgently need African-led solutions that can manage this endemic. Statistics show that not only is this advice affecting African communities and economies, but it is also now presenting a major threat to peace and security in Africa. The continent is not only a major transit route in the international trade to control drugs, but also major consumer and distributor. The situation is dire, and practical and workable solutions should be put in place and urgently implemented. We hope today's webinar will help unpack the current status and propose workable solutions going forward. Without further ado, and on behalf of IPSS, the Tana Secretariat, I wish this forum, particular forum, great success in its discussions and outcomes today. I thank you. I hand over to the moderator to take us through the business of the day. Over to you, Rubiat.
Thank you, Letty. We'll now have a keynote address from Mr. Sabelo Mbokazi, Head of Labor and Employment and Migration Department of Social Affairs at African Union. He'll be joining us online as well. Mr. Sabelo, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
We would like to thank the organizers of the meeting, and we are very much excited to be part of this Pre-Tana multi-stakeholder forum, which is happening today. We would like also, on behalf of the African Union, extend our well wishes for the organizers of the meeting. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, human trafficking sometimes is referred to as trafficking in person, is a transnational crime that has affected the African continent for a very long time. Illegal trafficking networks have taken advantage of vulnerability of migrants, of vulnerability of women, of vulnerability of children in some parts of the continent, sometimes due to the conflicts, lack of employment, other livelihood opportunities, and protracted asylum regimes in most host countries, among other factors, to lure their victims into their illegal networks. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, research indicates that most African countries are either a source or transit, as many of these victims end up in Europe, Asia, and other regions for forced sexual exploitation, among others. That's why we would like to congratulate the organizers of the meeting, because it is clear that Africa is confronted with this phenomenon of human trafficking, this phenomenon of trafficking in person. This is what we see, and therefore we would like to congratulate you because you are responding to an issue that is spreading and that is increasing in Africa. In the past decade, economic challenges increased conflicts in the region, climate change, multiple and widening inequalities and discrimination, the rise of conservatism in politics and religion, amongst others, have also led to increase in migration from the region and further impacting on the closely related risks for human trafficking in human beings and smuggling. I would like to pause at this point and remind the participants of this meeting that AU is very much seized with the situation in Libya, where we see that the issue in Libya is changing the picture all the time. It started as migration, but then we see a lot of also human trafficking, and there's a lot of human misery and suffering that we see due to all these illicit activities such as human trafficking. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished colleagues, the continent is not only a major transit route in the international trade of controlled drugs, but also a major consumer and distributor. And this is the bleak picture that really requires all of us to work together to be able to confront and to deal with illicit activities. Coupled with the youth bulge and growing level of unemployment, this scenario poses further threats to security in Africa. I know that as you work in this domain, you know that about 3.7 million people in Africa live in modern slavery, and we cannot allow this to continue. The issue that has become almost mind-boggling is the fact that human trafficking is conducted sometimes with the complicity of close family members, relatives, friends, communities are also the ones which are found at the center of this illicit activity, the human trafficking. We see that organized criminal groups are also recognized to take part in the human trafficking for various forms of exploitation, making it more complex and threatening. The situation is further worsening by the impacts of COVID-19 and other health pandemics, which also have led to a devastating impact on the trafficked persons. Ladies and gentlemen, the human trafficking has caused suffering a lot during the past decades. Those who are trafficked, they suffer a lot during their ordeal in the hands of traffickers and their accomplices. They undergo exploitation of various forms. Hence, it affects them physically, psychologically, including disrupting their lives and their livelihoods. As such, the AU member states and the rest should develop measures to support these victims to recover from their experiences by providing them with durable solutions, measures at their earliest possible time. This may include ensuring their protection as they undergo and the support of the state in the prosecution and judicial processes of the perpetrators. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this is a challenge for Africa. This is a challenge for regional economic communities, but it's a challenge for all of us as the technical experts in this area. Having painted that maybe a gloomy picture, perhaps it is, I should make a few comments about what the African Union is doing. The African Union developed the Wakawoku Action Plan, but we also are aware that there is a migration policy framework for Africa, which was adopted by the heads of state in 2018, which we are implementing now. And human trafficking is a major part of this policy framework, and therefore we are glad to extend an opportunity for more collaboration, for more cooperation amongst ourselves and amongst the organization. In fact, it is one of the reasons why we thought this Pre-Tana session that focuses on human trafficking, it's important, and we are not here because we can do better, but we are here so that we can form more collaboration, more working relationship with you, with all ladies and gentlemen and distinguished colleagues, so that we can able to combat the human trafficking and all these illicit activities. You know very well that the African Union also has adopted the 10-year plan, which is focusing on reducing and combating child labor, but also modern slavery and human trafficking. So, ladies and gentlemen, the policy frameworks are available. The will from your side, also we can see that there is a willing to work in this area, and we are all organized. So we believe that together we can make a difference in supporting the member states to be able to deal decisively with the illicit activities such as human trafficking. And with these few words, we would like to thank you once more, and would like to wish you a fruitful deliberation for this meeting. We thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sabela, for your time and for your contribution. We'll now move on to the first session. It's on human and drug trafficking and security in Africa. For that, I would like to invite the moderator, Ambassador, His Excellency Ambassador Salah Ahmed, to take the floor. Ambassador, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here, and you have the floor, please.
Well, a very good morning to all of you, and welcome to this first session of today's program. As I have been introduced by the moderator, my name is Salah Ahmed. I'm from the Political Affairs and Peace and Security Department of the African Union Commission. Thank you very much. I must begin by thanking the organizers, Tana Forum and the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, for bringing us together this morning. I see many around the tables here in the room, and also I'm sure there are many online. So hopefully this session will be an interactive one, and we will make it as such. I was hoping that this table will be filled by 3 panelists, but apparently the 3 of them will be zooming in. So let me quickly introduce the session and also introduce the panelists before I call on them to begin the program. This session will be addressing the issue of human and drug trafficking and security in Africa. So the impact of human trafficking as well as drug trafficking on the peace and security in Africa. We hope by the end of the session we will be able to address a number of issues, at least, if not all of them, to at least come to a clear definition of what is human trafficking and drug trafficking, and of course identify the causes for this phenomena and try to discuss further the current situation on the ground. Then we will try to address the impact of COVID-19 on this issue, and hopefully we will be guided in that by what we have heard so far from the interim director of the African Peace and Security Program, as well as the president and also head of the Labor, Unemployment and Migration Department, not department but division of the Department of Social Affairs, Mr. Sabelo. So guided by these two previous presentations, hopefully we'll be able to quickly dive in and try to keep the time, since we began a bit late on time. My members of the panel, or the panelists for this session, I have Ms. Maureen Acheng. Ms. Maureen Acheng is the Chief of Mission of IOM to Ethiopia and also representative to the African Union and UNECA. IOM is the International Organization of Migration, as we all know. We'll also have Mr. John Kruger. He's the head of Transitional Organized Crime, Illicit Trafficking and Terrorism Programs, Regional Security Focal Point for the United Nations Office of the Drug and Crime, and that is, of course, the Regional Office for Eastern Africa. And our third panelist is Mr. Francis Xavier Wego, the Special Representative of the Interpol. He's also part of the International Criminal Police Organization, that is the Interpol to the African Union. So I will be also adding more information on our panelists, members of the panel, later on. But let's try to first begin by a simple question. What is really human trafficking and what is drug trafficking? Before we even dive into this very important topic during this session, let me call on our first panelist, and that is Ms. Maureen Acheng. As I mentioned earlier, she is the IOM representative to Ethiopia and to African Union, and prior to her current position, Ms. Acheng served as head of the International Partnership Division at IOM, and also before that she was head of mission or chief of mission to Haiti. I'm glad she left before the earthquake. And Ms. Acheng also started her career with IOM in Haiti, and she is a citizen of Kenya. With that, let me call on Acheng to just begin by addressing this issue of what is really human trafficking and drug trafficking. Ms. Acheng, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. And good morning to all colleagues on the call. Thank you very much to Tana Forum for the invitation. I would also wish to congratulate Tana Forum on its choice of theme. We talk a lot about human trafficking and indeed also smuggling in migrants, we do not often enough put the two things together, human trafficking and human and drug trafficking. And yet we know that the intersections between these two things are pretty obvious, and there is need for a more collective view of both phenomena if they're to be tackled meaningfully. We had from the African Union colleague, Mr. Sabello, of some of the work that the AU is already doing on this matter. Human trafficking in Africa is increasingly prevalent. We know from the most recent data that 23% of global and human trafficking takes place in Africa. And according to the 2018 Global Slavery Index, over 9.2 million people living in Africa are living in conditions that are tantamount to modern slavery. So Africa accounts for about a quarter of global human trafficking. We know that this is reflective of the socio-political and also economic climate in many parts of the continent. Within Africa, the eastern and southern regions continue to dominate in numbers in terms of smuggling in migrants. These are irregular migrants, oftentimes moving in conditions that are described as mixed migratory flows, meaning that you have all sorts of migrants, economically driven, but also refugees. You have people fleeing conflict. You have all manner of people moving through the same methods, facilitated by the same people. Hence the term ascribed to them, to these movements as mixed migratory flows. In West Africa, although there are free movement agreements in that region that have been in place for a long time and that work fairly well, we know that the numbers of trafficking victims are pretty high. And again, this is where the emphasis ought to be. It's not so much on the facility of movement, but how voluntary is that movement and what are the purposes for which some of these people are moving or being moved. We know that most of the victims, and we'll hear more of this, I'm sure, from the UNODC colleague, but we know that a lot of the cases of smuggling detected in Africa are in West Africa, the very region that has a free movement protocol. So a lot of the incidents of trafficking in children, forced labor of children and women are to be found rather in this region where there is established free movement. So again, important to emphasize, it's not so much the facility with which people can move, but how they're moving and to what end they're moving, and whether they're moving of their own free will or being trafficked for purposes of forced labor. We also know that North Africa in recent times has become an important hub on the continent of transit activity for migrants originating from sub-Saharan Africa with the objective of getting to Europe. Important to add here that a lot of migrants start off as willing participants in the process. They get a trafficker to help them get to their desired destination, but very quickly that relationship changes into one of, switches from a relationship of smuggling to a relationship of trafficking. The person becomes a trafficked victim because the smuggler decides to extort them for more money, or and when they're not able to pay for it, they're put into conditions of forced labor as a way of either extorting the money or recuperating some of the money that the smuggler will have spent on them. According to, again, we're focused, of course, in this discussion on Africa, but I think it's also important to cast the net a bit more broadly globally. According to Global, approximately 800,000 victims are trafficked across international borders every year. Again, as I indicated earlier, a quarter of these are to be found on the continent. What is interesting about this topic is that, again, we're bringing the two things together, human trafficking and drug trafficking. The intersection between the two phenomena are led as trafficking are crimes perpetrated by the same people or using the same methods, but oftentimes what is driving them is the desire to make profit. So important as this Tana Forum discussion is doing to bring the two things together, because they're the same people or they're using the same methods. If we're to get to solutions to trafficking and smuggling, we need to look at the issue more holistically by bringing the by taking account of the fact that the same people are involved in the same, and drug trafficking are also interlinked with the operational of transnational criminal groups and networks, combining drug trafficking, arms trafficking, money laundering. All of these crimes intersect and actually come together with one objective alone: profit. Important to also underline that we hear a lot about the fact that a lot of the victims of trafficking and people that are being smuggled are getting younger and younger. So the phenomenon of unaccompanied migrant children being trafficked across borders is growing. But we should not lose sight of the fact that a lot of the trafficked victims are also young men who often don't get as much attention as is needed. But again, if you look at what's happening between the Horn of Africa, when people are vulnerable, they're more susceptible to be displaced persons. Again, this is a ripe group for recruitment by smugglers and traffickers. So in terms of root causes, we really need to look at what is being done in some of these instances where there are large cases of displacement. So both drug and human trafficking have a mobility dimension. IOM seeks to respond through the identification of vulnerable migrants and provide assistance to them by boosting referral to protection mechanisms that exist within countries. An important statistic to put out is for Africa is the following. Of the 4,799 victims detected in 26 sub-Saharan African countries, 3,336 were in West Africa. Again, this shows you that it isn't so much about the facility of movement, the fact that there is freer or fewer impediments to mobility. It is about why these people are moving and what happens to them at their destination. Hence the importance, even where free movement regimes exist, and I know there's a lot of excitement on the continent about the free movement protocol and what potential this has to spur economic activity on the continent, but this will not happen. The economic potential of the free movement protocol will not be fully realized if a lot of that movement takes place in an irregular manner, and if a lot of those people that are moving are victims of smugglers and human traffickers. We also are coming out of a difficult, actually, I shouldn't say coming out. We're still right in the thick of a global pandemic. And we have that very recent experience of what the impact of COVID-19 has been in terms of not just limited mobility, but the loss of livelihoods for many. So in Africa, the real impact of the crisis is likely to be socio-economic, and the impact of that is already being felt. It's not too much of a stretch to say that we're likely to see the numbers of people being trafficked or smuggled across borders increase as people look to, desperately look to whatever livelihood opportunities they can find either within their borders or across borders. The UN Security Council has expressed concern over the links between trafficking and conflict, noting the serious challenges posed to victims by transnational organized crimes, and again, trafficking in persons, but equally in drugs. Same people, same methods. Perhaps the merchandise that they deal in is what is different. So in terms of what some of the solutions could be.
Maureen, we are not yet there at the solutions, so allow me to stop you here if you don't mind. We're going to come back to you. My next panel member or panelist is not as announced, is not Mr. John Kruger, as I mentioned earlier, but is Mr. Julius Lomoku. Julius Lomoku is a Kenyan by nationality and currently a crime prevention and criminal justice officer, law enforcement expert at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes. Welcome, my brother, and we're happy to have you with us this morning via Zoom to just continue the discussion that began by Maureen, who really shared with us an excellent response to the questions that were raised. From your position within this office of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, I'm sure you have a global picture of what is really going on concerning this problem that we are addressing today, the human trafficking as well as drug trafficking. So now could you please begin from a global perspective and try to zoom into Africa as one of your regions and tell us, is it only that the reasons are socio-economic reasons, or there are other reasons that are really fueling these two issues that we are discussing today? Mr. Julius, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. First and foremost, all protocols observed. I'm also glad to be part of this Pre-Tana forum and to discuss this global issue, which is not only affecting Africa, but it's a global thing. Most of those speakers who spoke before me basically painted a picture of how these crimes of drug and human trafficking is getting to be really a big issue in the world. From the UNODC perspective, especially the program of transnational organized crime, as well as counterterrorism, we really in the forefront of supporting member states, building the capacity of law enforcement, especially to curb or to try to combat this particular criminality. I would just like to point out that human trafficking, if we look, or even drug trafficking, does not only happen across borders, because when you look at it, it cuts through continents and as well as internally within the states or within the country. Because as the first presenter talked about, he talked about modern slavery that is really happening. We've seen that some of the push and the pull factors play a very big role in enhancing this particular crime. And coming from the global point of view, there is origins countries as well as destination. And if I could maybe just refer to one of the reports of the United Nations Security and Economic Forum, it highlighted that strategies to address human trafficking should address demand as actually the root cause of human trafficking. What I mean by referring to this is that if you look globally, other than the push factors, which are more economic, if we dwell into that, we'll also see that the biggest other pull factor is the demand. Demand both globally and even locally. Coming into the region, or even looking at Africa as a continent, we're really, really high. From the statistics given by IOM, colleague who just presented now, you could see that it's really, really getting high. And also looking at the who are affected or the vulnerability, we see that in most of the research outcomes, we find that women and children, who are the vulnerable groups, really becomes targets. Now, sharing from a practical example that I was just following news yesterday from the Kenyan perspective, we saw a number of young girls being trapped in Saudi Arabia. In fact, it was trending in the news even yesterday, and I think still going on. It was a debate, actually, I was trying to follow up yesterday. And you find that so many factors are being discussed here. What pushes these victims to become victims of human trafficking? If you look critically, you will see that we can maybe look at them in three levels, which I think everybody is aware, that economic factors, which plays the greatest role. Lack of employment, need for greener pastures or so forth. Look at the social factors itself, the family disintegration. Look at the political factors that brings about the issues of failed states or governments and the issue of insecurities. So if we are trying to look at a global solution to this, then we should be able to look at these factors very critically. And the question is, what are we doing as states to address these pull factors? Then again, looking at the destination countries, what is pulling all this? Why is the demand so high out there? Probably we could say the demand is high because of demand for cheap labor. Because if I refer to the Kenyan example, where girls were trafficked to Saudi Arabia, they are going to provide cheap labor in terms of households, and then they eventually end up being exploited. So what are we going to do about this? It's a question of how are we going to reduce the demand from the destination? How are we going to empower people from the origin, from the area of origin, so that these push factors will be much more reduced? So this is a question of the biggest issue of identification of this as a big threat to peace and security in Africa, and how best are we going to address this? Speaking from a law enforcement perspective, in most cases, law enforcement is being maybe has the mandate of basically trying to control crimes, but there are so many areas that even goes beyond law enforcement and also calls for like other areas of the community to come in. There's even other factors which excavate this kind of criminality, because when we look at the current pandemic, as the other presenter talked about issues of loss of economic power among the households and among the people who are living in the states of origin. So based on issues of criminality, looking at the area of criminology, it says that if somebody cannot be able to make ends meet, of course, there should be an alternative area to make or to survive, for that matter. And obviously, criminality maybe.
Okay, Julius, we're going to come back to that. I will certainly come back to you before we conclude, so you can expand more on what platforms the UN has invented or created to tackle these two issues, and also in terms of coordination, collaboration between these platforms, what is the outcome so far? I will come to you in a minute, but before you answer that question and other questions that I have for you, let me go to my third panelist for today. And the third panelist for today is Mr. Francis Xavier Wego. He is an Assistant Inspector General of the Police, and he's a member of the Interpol, and he's a citizen of Uganda. And of course, he holds a master's degree in managing peace and security in Africa, which is a great field, of course, of importance to us. Mr. Francis, welcome. My question for you is very simple, so we can initiate this discussion with you. I'm sure you have numbers to share with us from your position within the Interpol about the current situation of human and drug trafficking in Africa. Could you please begin with this, and then, if you don't mind, to also tell us what is really the Interpol is doing to prevent human trafficking as well as drug trafficking in Africa in particular. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me.
We hear you loud and clear. Please proceed.
Are you hearing me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor, though virtually. It's the new norm these days. I want to thank the Tana Secretariat for considering the importance of Interpol in such a very important meeting. The topic of discussion today is very critical as it touches the people's lives and well-being. It's also worth to note that these crimes are organized and transnational, affecting the reproductive age of our society in Africa. My fellow panelists have already touched on this. And to this effect, Interpol takes these crimes among the priority ones. If I can quickly look at the threat assessment, and I would start with definitions of trafficking human beings and migrant smuggling, since we were asked this. I just share that although closely connected, trafficking in human beings and smuggling of migrants are different crimes. The difference lies in the end purpose and degree of consent of a transit victim / the client. Human trafficking, the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or service from unwilling victims. It can also arise through a vulnerable person being duped into false promises for better education, employment, and well-being. This has been touched. Migrant smuggling, as the name indicates, is the facilitation of the illegal entry of an individual into a country of which he or she is neither citizen nor a permanent resident. Although smuggled migrants can end up being forcibly trafficked against their will, often the transaction ends when the payment has been made. Let me touch briefly about the drivers of these crimes and start with the human trafficking. And this, Maureen touched it. Poverty, weak governance, armed conflicts, misinformation, and lack of protection from discrimination and marginalization. Large family size, lack of education opportunities and employment can also make a person vulnerable. The demand for cheap labor, adoption, traditional practices, and trafficking during and after conflicts act as pull factors too. The second thing to note is about trafficking in human beings and migrant smuggling in Africa is that each sub-region has peculiarities, with some countries having people fleeing armed conflicts and others offering better transit routes for trafficking. I wish to add also that corruption, which at times we refer to as enemy from within, is a major contributing factor. The trends has been talked about. Most African victims in foreign jurisdictions represent a significant flow of human trafficking occurs from our continent. Interregional human trafficking has been detected, whether as an intermediate step or as part of regional trafficking network. Analytical studies reveal that the majority of African migrants resettle or seek refuge in other African countries. Organized criminals are facilitating the illegal movement of people overland from the Horn of Africa to South Africa. Victims are sourced by agents offering better work opportunities, and the like. Others use the northern route through Libya to Mediterranean Sea, and others the eastern route via the Red Sea to Middle East. Allow me to share a very, very daring example that I still recall. In 2013, a goods container was loaded with 120 Ethiopians being trafficked to South Africa. They crossed the border to Kenya, then entered Tanzania, and when they reached Dodoma, 43 had suffocated to death, and the driver abandoned the truck. The same happened again in 2015, where again 15 victims suffocated to death, using the same method and the same route. This explains how the crime is brutal and the weaknesses in our border control management. Perhaps a more worrying angle of trafficking in persons is trafficking for organ removal. The principal driver of this illicit market is the unfortunate inability to supply human replacement organs following ethical transplant practices to meet an ever-increasing demand. This kind of trafficking is the most lucrative, and victim donors receive very little or a mere fraction of the total that the organ buyers are willing to pay. Let me touch on the issue of drug trafficking. The main drivers then are socioeconomic factors, such as increase in trade and transports, lack of alternative economic opportunities for youth, corruption, weak enforcement, and high profit margins for criminal syndicates who nurture this trend. The trends, the major drugs traffic in Africa, cocaine, heroin, and synthetics, and controlled drugs such as methamphetamine, diapine, and tramadol. Analytical reports indicate Africa is no longer just a transit route for these and other drugs, it is a production and consumption center as well. Heroin normally comes from Middle East. With the issues in Afghanistan, we expect a lot of heroin, and times by air to West Africa, by sea to Eastern Africa, before it is trafficked to Europe. I may briefly touch on the effects of COVID-19 on human drug trafficking. Since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, trafficking in persons went even further underground, making any reliable estimates of the scale of trafficking in persons more difficult. Loss of livelihoods and restrictions on movement have also led to traffickers recruiting victims in their local areas. The COVID-19 pandemic has created larger pools of vulnerable persons who, due to their worsened economic situation, are recruited for labor or sexual exploitations. Another consequence is that many migrants have lost their jobs in destination countries and are stranded, unable to return home, while large numbers of some are held in transit because of lockdowns and exposed to poor hygienic conditions by smugglers, increasing their vulnerability to this virus. I think 2 days back I had on news, there are many of our fellow Ethiopians who are stuck in the Middle East and they are arranging to be evacuated. So on the issue of drugs, I can share that drug trafficking depends on a functioning illicit economy, given that it is done clandestinely among streams of legal commerce. The use of drugs in bars and clubs implies their use depends on a vibrant service industry. A pandemic that imposes restrictions on movement and if extended quarantine is bound to have an impact, therefore, on drug demand, supply, and distribution. Studies have, however, showed that this wasn't the case. Some drug markets saw no change, others simply underwent change, adapting new routes and methods. Drug markets have been resilient to COVID-19 difficulties. And although it went down a bit from the beginning, by early 2021, the business had stabilized back to the pre-pandemic period. The COVID-19 pandemic also brought new trends in drug trafficking. The maritime route increased in volume due to border closures. It also led to shifts in drug use. Cocaine, heroin, and synthetic drugs were used less due to the closing of social and recreational avenues. Increased stress, boredom, more free time, and changes in financial resources triggered an increase in the use of cannabis, as well as the non-medical use of pharmaceuticals. Moderator, I don't know whether I can also go ahead and touch on the effect of this on security. If you allow me, I can briefly.
We'll come back to that in a bit, but thank you so much for your contribution. Let me go back to Maureen again and ask a very quick question, maybe if you don't mind, Maureen, to answer in a minute or two. From your experience with IOM here in Africa, I'm sure you have come across some initiatives, some efforts by our governments, our member states in Africa, to tackle this issue of drug trafficking as well as human trafficking. Could you please, in a minute or two, share with us from your experience, if you have come across any experience that you could share from any African country in that regard? Maureen?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And I apologize, but you're barely audible. So when you were speaking in an attempt to interrupt me, I couldn't even hear you. I'll keep it brief and to the point in terms of initiatives that many African countries are putting in place. Perhaps a good one to highlight here is the attempt at having whole of government approaches to deliberating on this issue. In the IGAD region, for example, IGAD member states took the decision to institute national coordination mechanisms whose objective are to ensure a whole of government approach to a complex issue such as the issue of irregular migration and trafficking and smuggling. So whole of government approaches that bring in the multiple, interagencies, ministries basically, that have migration functions, whether directly or indirectly. So that is one approach that many countries are using. Another approach, another example is actually to be found right here in Ethiopia, of community sensitization, because we know that a lot of the smugglers are actually viewed quite positively in the communities within which they operate as facilitators. So many of the participants on this forum will understand smugglers as being the bad guys, but actually in a lot of the communities of origin here in Ethiopia, the smugglers are viewed as brokers, as facilitators, as people who help the youth in the community get jobs in the Middle East, for example. So there's need for community sensitization, and there's been a lot of that right here in Ethiopia, with a view to ensuring that there is a good understanding at community level of why trafficking or giving your child over to a smuggler to get your child over to the Middle East is not a good thing to do and is likely to be damaging in the long run. So a community approach to the issue is helpful because, as we heard earlier, a lot of parents are involved in actually facilitating the smuggling of their children. So perhaps I'll stop at those two examples, and I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maureen. But again, if you don't mind, while you still have the floor, Could you also please elaborate a bit on the role that could be played by religious leaders, traditional leaders, and civil society, as well as media, within this community approach that you were talking about?
Well, within the community conversations model, we basically bring together community leaders, be they religious or otherwise, and the youth themselves to deliberate on what the challenges are that drive them to send their children to the Middle East. And we have religious leaders weighing in, but you also have community leaders, elected or unelected, weighing in on the matter, with a view to pointing families and youth to alternatives in terms of livelihood options to irregular migration. Because we have understood over the course of the decades that we've been at it on the issue of irregular migration, that it is insufficient to tell people not to use smugglers to get to their desired destinations if you do not give them alternatives. So the community conversations model intends to work collaboratively with the community and their leaders to look for alternatives to irregular migration that really help to diminish the incidence of smuggling using the services of traffickers and human smugglers. So religious leaders have a pivotal role to play, especially in a country that we know is as religious as Ethiopia is. I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Maureen. Let me move back again briefly to our brother Julius Lemaco. Julius, could you please tell us about any initiatives or efforts that currently in place to reduce the effect of drugs and human trafficking on youth, women, and children? While you are answering this question, also, if you don't mind to share with us if there is any, or to inform us if there is any platforms that have been built or developed or established by the United Nations or any other continental organization to tackle or to address these two issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, sir. Yes, from UNODC's perspective, we have a number of programs. As you know, that UNODC is a custodian of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its protocols, including the protocol on against trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. In this case, the organization is really supporting member states to build the capacity of various agencies involved in the fight against trafficking in persons. And these include issues of strengthening the policies of individual member states, as well as to be members and signatories to the relevant protocols of TIP and so on. In the case of trying to address the issue among the youth, we support a number of initiatives aimed at creating sensitization or awareness among the youth and among the victims also, and even among the law enforcement, because we are promoting the issue of victim-centered approach, which is human rights based, to ensure that at least in terms of trainings and as well as in terms of equipment where possible. On the platforms also, as I said, creating awareness is another big tool, because once the victims realize that the consequences of this crime are really impacting into their life, some losing their lives and so forth. Of course, once they get that kind of information and they will learn from experiences of what happened to the rest, I think it really impacts on their need to engage in these crimes. Social media, mainstream media, as well as issues of other sensitization forums will really help in disseminating this kind of information. That's all from my side, Mr. Moderator. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me go to, once again, to Mr. Francis. Mr. Francis, you ended your presentation by speaking about the effect of COVID-19 or the impact of COVID-19 and other issues scaling up the threats. So why COVID-19 did not slow down the human trafficking and also the drug trafficking in Africa? And also, if you don't mind, to share with us your thoughts about the impact of these two issues on peace and security in Africa. Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we lost Mr. Francis, so maybe Maureen can quickly jump in to speak to why COVID-19 did not slow down.
Hello.
Is that Mr. Francis?
Hello.
Hello? Mr. Francis?
I can hear you now. You are breaking.
Yes, Mr. Francis, we hear you. Did you hear the question?
No. If you can repeat the question, please.
Okay, the question is twofold. One, you ended your presentation by speaking about the impact of COVID-19 and the fact that COVID-19 did not slow down the human trafficking as well as the drug trafficking in Africa. Could you elaborate a bit on that and then quickly please touch on the impact of human trafficking, drug trafficking on peace and security in Africa? Briefly, please. Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, I haven't heard the first words of your question.
The first part of the question is about COVID-19. Why COVID-19 did not slow down human trafficking as well as drug trafficking in Africa?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. As I told you that human trafficking and drug trafficking, they are part of a larger criminal business industry. And I gave you the examples of the trend and also the drivers. The drivers did not stop, and also the trend did not stop. And these traffickers, both human and drug traffickers, they are people who have had a lot of money. I can give you an example that maybe on average, just to be smuggled, migrant smuggling from Africa to Europe is about $3,000 paid to illegal hands. So these people have got a lot of money that they use at times to influence people who are responsible for border control management. They're also in some weak states where some militias and some terrorists control part of the territory. These traffickers have established connections and they pay them to give them routes. So the business did not stop. What only stopped and maybe what changed are the routes. When the borders were closed, I told you that many of them shifted to using the water, but the business continued. And you also know that there are many people who are affected by the pandemic and became vulnerable. So this was another large pool to exploit. That's what I can share, Mr. Moderator, as of now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the second part of the question was the impact of human trafficking, drug trafficking on peace and security in Africa. Mr. Francis.
Yes, definitely, as I said, these two crimes are affecting reproductive age in our societies. And these people lose their lives many times others who get when they are not able to properly and on time. The other part is that the business continues, and then because of some weaknesses, must say some weaknesses in the governance, coupled with poverty, lack of employment opportunities, these people become vulnerable. And they can be vulnerable even to joining other crimes. So the peace is affected when you have your productive age being diverted and losing them and traffic. So it's very, very, very important that states address the structural and proximate causes of these two crimes, which I shared, of these people keeping home and contributing to the development of their own countries. Otherwise, it being exploited by traffickers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor in a minute, so please prepare yourself if you have a question. But before we open the floor, let me just go back to Maureen, not because she's the only female or woman part of the panel, but in fact because she also has a very rooted and deep experiences in the field. Maureen, briefly, again, the impact on peace and security from your point of view, and if you don't mind to just end by telling us in bullet points what could be done to tackle this issue at the grassroots level, the issue of human trafficking and drug trafficking. Very briefly, impact on peace and security and how to tackle these issues again in bullet points at the national and grassroots level. Thank you. Grassroots level. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I feel like I would be repeating myself, but I'll sum it up as follows to say that there's need for sensitization at community level to ensure that all would-be irregular migrants understand the hazards of irregular migration and to understand that the smugglers operating in their midst are actually nefarious elements and not people who are there to further their life goals. So that is one. Providing greater livelihood options in communities that are prone to high outbound irregular migration, a lot of it facilitated by smugglers, would be a second thing. Third would be, I know you asked me to focus on what can be done at community level, but the national level is even more important. A whole of government approach, a whole of society approach to the issue of irregular migration is needed if strides are to be made in eradicating the twin phenomena of smuggling in human beings and trafficking in migrants. And then last and not least, I would say, enhanced interstate cooperation, which some of the forums that I pointed to earlier would exist to facilitate. I'll stop at that, Mr. Moderator, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And let me add, if you don't mind, one last bullet point to what you just have listed, to also promote our free movement of peoples and goods in Africa, which is really an important pillar of the Agenda 2063. Now let's open the floor for questions and answers. The floor will be open for those who would like to take the floor. Kindly state your name, your organization, and briefly your question or comment. For those who are online, please raise your hand online by, I think you can raise your hand online, and I hope I could be assisted from the Secretariat to identify those who are online requesting the floor. Let's begin by giving the floor to our brother there at the end of the hall, please. Is there a microphone that could be used?
Thank you very much. My name is Broga Machu. I came from Feeder Brown Charity Organization. I thank you all for Mr. Ambassador and all panelists. My question is, what we see is the government, all this to tackle this challenge, only the problem, to challenge this problem, they are using the government to tackle this problem only by formal governmental institution to tackle this problem. However, what could the state do to tackle this challenge involving the civil societies? So my question is this one: what could the state do to tackle this challenge involving civil societies? What we see currently only taken by government and formal justice instrument or legal institutions. So what could do involve the state, civil societies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have the floor. Did.
Thank you. Good morning. Okay, I have to introduce myself, right? My name is Tigist Ishwas. I'm a senior advisor to the Minister on Peace Building and Reconciliation, to the Minister of Peace. But my home base is actually IPSS. I'm an assistant professor at IPSS. Thank you, Ambassador Salah, for the excellent moderation, and also our speakers. Thank you so much for your interventions. I have one brief question, kind of touched by Ambassador Salah and the previous participant. IOM and Interpol and UN, what practical things have you done to really tackle the challenges of this crisis related to human, drug, and arms trafficking? Practical work, if there is any practical work or experience that you could share us. We've touched upon here and there, but I would love to hear also if you have done some work like as UN, IOM at the national level and the regional level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Andrew? Is that Dr. Andrew? Please.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Ambassador. My name is Andrew Sata Samoa from the Institute for Security Studies. And I would like to thank you so much for the excellent moderation, but also the inputs that we've received from the speakers. I have a couple of comments and questions to follow. My first is the role of Africa in drug trafficking. And I think that over time, we are seeing that Africa is gradually moving from the position of transshipment point now to a consumption point. When it was largely transshipment, it made sense that the focus or the drive for law enforcement was externally driven. And what I mean by that is that the funding and the push was coming from European and American countries because they were on the receiving end of the supply. But with the movement towards consumption that we are seeing in Africa, I would have expected a commensurate rise in terms of Africa's efforts to police drug trafficking from our own end. But it does appear that so far, the drive is still so much externally driven. And that is why if you are traveling out of Africa, the focus in terms of search for drug you are carrying are much more robust than when you are coming into the continent. The same way, it looks like the focus for intra-regional, even and provincial distribution of drugs and law enforcement at that level is still not as robust as we do because it's still externally driven. And I think going forward, we need to look at how we look at that as our problem rather than the problem of others in which we are trying to help them to fight. And that is a very important premise on which we need to proceed. The second point, Ambassador, because of time, I'll touch on two things and come in later if time permits. My second point has to do with the point that the third speaker made on the role of maritime distribution points as an entry point. And I think this goes to add to, again, numerous points and emphasis on the fact that our policing of our territorial waters in most cases is non-existent. And so you look at all sorts of criminality happening, and we all know that is a huge blind spot. But if you look at the continental response, right from the African Union all the way to national level, focus on improving capacity to monitor our territorial waters, it seems we are not really taking it that serious. And so I would like to find out from the speaker whether he knows of any robust attempt to try and address that as a blind spot in the whole arena of Africa's response to the crisis, not just in terms of migrant smuggling, but also in terms of drug smuggling. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew. I will come back again to the floor. Please prepare yourself if you have any question, but let me go online. It looks like there's someone who would like to take the floor. Please go ahead. I cannot read the name from far.
Hello, can you hear me?
My dear Rahimat, please go ahead.
Very much, Salah. Good to see you and others. My name is Rahimat Mamadou. I'm from the ECOWAS Commission in Abuja, Nigeria. I have a couple of questions, but let me, for the sake of time, just ask Maureen one question, because in her presentation, she kept saying that in spite of the free movement, or maybe it's because of the free movement, that the case of trafficking within West Africa seemed to be high. I'm curious to know why, based on her statistics, why she thinks that, because from what she was saying, it appears that she said the free movement, ease of movement within West Africa seems to contribute to higher trafficking in West Africa, because that's something that I'm very curious about. And perhaps we want to work with IOM to get to the bottom of that. Why do you think so? Because like Salah was saying, Salah was including free movement and trade when you were making your, giving your proposals. But if what you say is happening in West Africa is the case, it's indirectly saying that free movement may not really be as effective as we think on the continent, if it will have the attendant issue of facilitating smuggling and trafficking in persons. So my question is to Maureen.
Thank you so very much, Rahimat, my dear sister. We have taken note of your question. Let me move on to Mr. Ibrahim Atom. Mr. Ibrahim Atom, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. And I am Ibrahim Muhammad from Sudan. My concern has been even touched by our previous colleagues, the two ones, because my concern is going to the common borders. I mean, I'm talking about within Africa itself. We talk about the freedom of movement, and yet people within the neighboring countries, they never feel that they are foreigner to each one, because the issue of the common tribes, the common relationship between this country and the other country, or somebody they move like, if we said, for example, Ethiopia to Sudan, or from Sudan to Ethiopia. They never feel that they are foreigners, and they never feel sometimes they are going from this country or to the other country. They are just feeling as they are moving from their village and to their relatives' village, and it will ease the human trafficking and the drug trafficking We need a mechanism, a strong mechanism, to make a balance between the need of the freedom of movement and the tackle of the issue of the human trafficking and drug trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Ibrahim Tom, for your question and contribution. Let me take another one or two questions from the floor before I return back to our speakers. Any question from the floor? Or should I go ahead and ask questions to the floor? Dr. Andrew, you have the floor again, please. Thank you.
Two things, actually. I'm thinking that when it comes to the question of drug trafficking, the response has been largely law enforcement. And so sometimes it's a little difficult. And even within that, it does appear that those we celebrate interceptions and all of those things at the airports and all these places, we hardly get to the kingpins and then the drug lords. And so we celebrate, the young people and all the moles who are being intercepted and all of that. But we all do know that if you follow the money, there are bigger people sitting somewhere, completely masked from what it looks like, who are really behind it. And so it looks like even if we are going to use law enforcement, we need wider, much more strategic, investigations that can pick out certain people and deal with them appropriately. But one of the key connections that I want to draw between the whole conversation around human trafficking and drug trafficking, I think this forum tries to force us to think about the two together. And so one of the areas where I see vulnerability is really, and the link between the two, is human trafficking exposing young people who are usually first-time travelers as easy use of them as moles. And a lot of these who are given parcels and have no idea what they are carrying, and then they are intercepted and they can't even tell you who gave them such parcels. And so sometimes we also need to look at human trafficking becoming a very easy source of, recruitment for drug trafficking purposes. Because when the young lady looks so innocent, the young man looks innocent, and a first-time traveler without experience, the chances of them getting really used are extremely high in that sense. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so very much, Dr. We have one last question online from Mr. Julian, or from Julian Rabovu. Julian, you have the floor. I think Julian cannot hear the moderator. So with that, we go back. You would like to take the floor, ma'am? No? Thank you. So let's go back to our speakers and try to see how they're going to answer the questions and respond to the comments that were made. I'm going to begin this time by Mr. Francis. Mr. Francis, you have the floor, and please in 3 minutes, try to respond to some of the questions that were raised as well as the comment and other contributions. Please go ahead, you have the floor.
You hearing me?
Yes, please go ahead, my brother, and respond to some of the questions and comments that were raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I will begin with the question of government. What do government do to involve civil society in this issue? I think it's a very, very valid question, because government will not be all alone. I think we need an all-inclusive approach in this case. And I'll give you an example of what we did as UNODC, trying to promote this kind of cooperation between the government and the civil society. We did a number of workshops trying to bring these agencies together, especially law enforcement and civil society, to create that kind of awareness as far as trafficking in persons is concerned.
Thank you very much, Julius, for this response. I'm not sure if Mr. Francis is back online or not. Mr. Francis, are you back online?
I'm online. I'm hearing you.
Very good. I hope you were able to hear some of the questions and comments that were raised. If so, please go ahead and respond, if you don't mind. Thank you.
I'll start with the first question, the issue involving civil society organizations. I support that idea, and the civil society organizations can be used in terms of supporting training, in terms of awareness campaigns, in terms of rehabilitation of victims and the like. So involvement of civil society organizations is very, very important. And there was a question on what practical things are being done to address this problem. And I go on the Interpol side. I would say that on trafficking human beings and smuggling of migrants, Interpol's strategy is centered on empowering police in member countries to investigate and handle cases. This is achieved through training that involves building long-term capacity. by sharing the latest investigation and victim interview techniques. The organization also has capabilities, expertise, tools, and systems for sharing crime intelligence through its secure global communication system. Through these notices, diversions, alerts, modus operandi, and over 18 databases on crime and criminality are provided to our member states through the National Central Bureaus to utilize them in identification of crimes, criminals, and investigation of cases. In addition, Interpol supports global field operations to disrupt and dismantle human trafficking networks. I can give you just one example. This year, there is an operation which Interpol supported, Operation Weka, and this operation was targeting on traffickers and rescuing victims. And 222 individuals were arrested, 249 victims rescued, and 1,115 irregular migrants were identified. If I go on the area of drug trafficking, Interpol supports member countries through the following: carrying out global operations against drug trafficking and providing assistance to ongoing investigations, doing criminal analysis on drug trafficking routes, modus operandi, and criminal networks involved, and then providing comprehensive training for police worldwide to better tackle drug trafficking. Again, we support operations, and this year in July, there was an operation which led to arrest of 207 individuals and a seizure of narcotic drugs worth 100 million euros. That's from what we are doing, but I want also to touch briefly on the issue of which was raised on lack of focus on maritime security. I think this is very, very true. If some of you have been to some of these island states in Africa, you'll find very many leisure, high-speed boats by people seemingly to be very, very, very rich. And they go and take their rides deep into the waters. And they meet the vessels which are carrying the drugs from various areas we talked about. They offload from there, and they will come as if they are on a leisure ride, and then distribute to smaller vehicles, the canoes, just on the border, on the land borders, and then they enter into Africa. So there is a need for states to really support improvement in maritime security, patrols that go into deeper waters. There was an issue, I think, raised by Dr. Andrew, the issue of, people who normally get arrested with the drugs. When we are talking of drug trafficking, we are talking of the trafficker and then the carrier. And you find that the people who are carrying the drugs, actually, they at times they don't know, they have been told, take this parcel from here to Dubai and the like, and you find someone, and they give us some little money. And in many other cases, the trafficker goes ahead. I talked about bribery. And he buys off the roof, says, my consignment is coming, this with law enforcement agencies, and all these things. Again, we have to address some of those weaknesses in the border control mechanisms, and also increase very good collaboration and partnerships among law enforcement agencies. I'll give you an example of a project which Interpol is supporting, called AirCop project, that is connecting airports in Southern America and Africa, select airports, where it's highly suspected as a source and also transiting or destination, to provide them quick and timely secure communication for sharing information. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Mr. Francis, for your clear answers and response. And last but not least, let me give the floor to Maureen Acheng once again to respond to the questions, and also among the questions, that question from Rahimat from ECOWAS. Maureen, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I'll respond to the questions in the order in which they came. One was the issue of civil society and how, if at all, they are involved. And the short response to that is yes. A lot of the work that we as IOM seek to do with governments in addressing the twin phenomena of trafficking and smuggling involve governments, but through a whole of government and whole of society prism. And whole of society, by definition, includes civil society. And now that will take different forms in different contexts, as is to be expected. The second question was, what work specifically have we done to tackle human trafficking at national and at international level? At national level, again, I touched on some of this in my presentation earlier, is the community conversations model, which is an innovation. In the past, all we did was information campaigns to deter people from, to give people information intended to deter them from resorting to irregular migration. However, the community conversations model takes on a much broader outlook, taking account of the fact that if the push factors are extremely compelling, no amount of accurate information on the hazards of irregular migration will stop people from undertaking these dangerous journeys. So a lot of community conversations going on at grassroots level with the objective of providing alternative livelihood options. Second is national legislation. In order to be able to apprehend traffickers and smugglers, there's need for legislation. A lot of countries have a lot of legislation, but not always specific enough to be able to criminalize, apprehend, and punish the perpetrators. Some of the work that we have done at national level, including here in Ethiopia, has been to put in place the legislation to equip the government with the necessary legislation to be able to do all three: criminalize, apprehend, and punish. Third is the area-based community development approach, targeting regions that are prone to high outbound migration. That is an area of work we continue to focus on, with a view to really zeroing in on the areas that we know are the hardest hit in terms of irregular migration, a lot of it using the services of smugglers and human traffickers. At continental level, I mentioned two forums, the ROC and then the AU Horn of Africa initiative. And this also links up with one of the other questions about a lot of the initiatives on the continent being too externally driven. A statement that I would not necessarily disagree with. I think we see a lot of that, but again, the two forums that I pointed to, especially the AU Horn of Africa initiative, is very much homegrown. This is a collection of African Union member states that have come together with the intention of ensuring homegrown solutions to problems in the Horn of Africa region in terms of smuggling and trafficking. So the second part of that question is forums that allow countries to come together to deliberate on what solutions might look like. Rahimat on the third question, which I think is a critical question. Free movement has been celebrated a lot, especially in recent times, ever since the protocol was adopted. It's yet to come into force. That's the Continental Protocol on Free Movement. And do the statistics then that are being put out suggest that free movement could actually spur yet more cases of smuggling and trafficking? Perhaps I'll give more background to this, which is to note that of the 4,800 approximately victims of trafficking in sub-Saharan Africa, the fact that 80% of those were to be found in West Africa would seem to suggest that this has linkages with the fact of West Africa being the most advanced in terms of free movement. My guess, but actually before I say that, let me say this is from a UNODC global report on trafficking in persons for the year 2020. And here I will defer to my UNODC colleague to elaborate on those findings if he has anything more to offer. But from my perspective, I would say that not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily flow as a conclusion from this that free movement equals higher incidence of smuggling and trafficking. It doesn't have to. The fact of the matter is that West Africa is the most integrated of all the regions on the continent. So there are more people moving, and it is to be expected that there would be more cases of smuggling and trafficking than you find elsewhere where there's more restrictions on movement. But this is not to make a case against free movement. This is to say that, yes, free movement is a good thing, but let us ensure that free movement happens in a way that is protection sensitive, and let's ensure that border management agencies are equipped to, even in a free movement context, ensure that there are the needed protection mechanisms built into a new posture on border management to still be able to apprehend smugglers and traffickers. The fact that you can move freely does not mean that it is okay to move you for purposes of forced labor from one country to another or within a country. So it could well be that data gathering was easier in that region than in other regions, but I would hazard, I guess, that it is because more people are moving in West Africa that there are more cases of smuggling and trafficking being detected than in other regions where there are fewer people moving. But again, I defer to ODC because those statistics emanate from an ODC trafficking in persons report that dates back to 2020. Mr. Moderator, if you allow me, I would just finish by making this one point that I think the Tana Forum has done well to bring these two topics together, trafficking in persons and drug trafficking. But I would like to suggest that rather than discuss them in isolation, because I have talked about smuggling trafficking in human beings and smuggling in persons, and my other colleagues have talked mostly about drug trafficking. I think rather than discuss them in isolation, it would be helpful to delve into the inherent interconnections between these two different forms of criminality that use the same methods, with a view to determining what impactful solutions we might wish to look at. So it is a great start to have a session that brings the two together, but I feel that we have still discussed them by and large in isolation. I'll stop at that, Mr. Moderator, and I thank you and the audience very much for the engagement, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in other forums. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Maureen. There is one final question online. What is Africa's strategy on development with regards to maritime security? How many countries in Africa even have a navy, let alone ships? I'm not going to read the rest of the question because it is just an elaboration of it. Let me call on Mr. Francis to try to answer this question if possible. Mr. Francis, the floor is yours, and please, after you answer the question, if possible, if you don't mind, to share with us your concluding remarks in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I think it's a difficult question for me to answer because different states have different capabilities and also the capacity to deploy and improve their maritime security. However, largely, you will understand also that we have a challenge on the maritime borders within our coastal continents. We have had also challenges where you stop, where the international waters. So I think there is a need for African states to come together and see how do we patrol, maybe joint patrols or regional joint patrols in areas beyond our jurisdictions. Because as I explained, some of these luxurious boats which come and they are claiming they are on tourism, they go deep into the waters and then come back to distribute to smaller boats and the like. That's what I would really share. Now, as my concluding remarks, I would really share with all the participants that Interpol is always ready to support member countries with its policing capabilities and expertise. You are aware that the African Union took a decision, I think, January 2019, to have the Regional Operations Center in Khartoum on migrant smuggling transited to a continental center, which was a very good observation because human trafficking, the Khartoum was looking at the northern route, yet we have the eastern route, southern route, and even the western route. So we are working with the African Union to support the center, and we also support all other efforts to have all areas that need the support really developed by law enforcement agencies. Then finally, and I mentioned it, that really states should address the structural and proximate causes. And also someone has said involvement of all actors, including civil societies. Because when you see people voluntarily entering a goods container without fear of suffocation, and others offering their body organs for money, this is the highest level of being desperate for survival. And all efforts need to be put in place by all actors to reverse this trend. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Mr. Francis, for your concluding remarks. Mr. Julius Lemanco, you have a minute for your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thanks for giving me this opportunity for the concluding remarks. Mine is just to stress the need for identification of the threat. We all need to at least identify the threat, identify the capabilities, and addressing the root causes. I would just like to state that UNODC still encourages member states to become fully members and of the protocol against trafficking in persons as well as smuggling of migrants, and to ensure that the legal frameworks as well as policies are well adequately in place to address this particular crime. Otherwise, as UNODC, especially the Transnational Organized Crime and Counterterrorism Program, we stand ready to support member states upon request to build their capacity as far as law enforcement is concerned, and even other agencies, or even promoting the interstate cooperation as well as interagency cooperations in the fight against trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. Thank you very much, and over to you, Moderator.
Thank you very much indeed, Julius, for your concluding remarks. Madame Maureen, any concluding remarks? Or you already, well, a minute for concluding remarks, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Moderator, but I think I already shared my concluding thoughts on this session, which is just to say that let us continue to delve deeper, perhaps not in this forum, in subsequent ones or other ones, on the interconnections between drug trafficking and human trafficking, because we need innovative approaches to resolving this. There's been endless discussions on these issues over the decades, and yet I think we can agree that both phenomena have continued to grow. So I think there's an urgency to the need for innovation if we're to fundamentally disrupt this business model that thrives on human desperation. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much indeed, Madame Maureen, for your concluding remarks. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with that we come to the end of this session. What I really would like to say at the end of this session is, when we are talking about human trafficking, we are indeed talking about African young men and women and children. And when we are talking about drug trafficking, we are also talking about African women, young men and children that are affected. Africa adopted its action, or its action plan to build the continent, that is Agenda 2063. And if you look at Agenda 2063, ladies and gentlemen, you will see that Africa is putting a great emphasis on its youth. Why? Because Africa, as we all know, is the youngest continent. It is a continent with a majority of over 65% of its population that are youth below the age of 35. So our real assets is naturally our natural resources. We see so many countries that have developed in the West, in Europe and others, without having really access to natural resources. So natural resources are naturally the real means for developing and for progressing and for building a future. But in fact, the human being is the real assets. And for us as Africans, our youth are our greatest assets. And we see them unfortunately dying in the Sahara because of thirst, and we see them drowning in the Mediterranean, trying to cross to Europe, and even in the Red Sea, trying to cross to the Arabian island. When can we say enough is enough as Africans? When can we say that we really need to take care of our assets, the real assets that we have, to take care of our youth, men and women, so then we can build the Africa that we want, the Africa that is united, prosperous, and peaceful. Please join me in thanking our speakers for today. During this session, Ms. Maureen Acheng, the Chief of Mission to Ethiopia and representative to the African Union and UNECA of the International Organization for Migration, and Mr. Julius Lamako from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Regional Office for Eastern Africa, and Mr. Francis Xavier Wego, a special representative from the International Criminal Office, or Criminal Police Organization, that is Interpol, to the African Union. I'm sure you'd agree with me that they deserve a round of applause. Well, I don't know why, maybe it is lunchtime, that is why the round of applause is not too strong. Can we do it again, please? And I hope you'd agree with me that the moderator also deserves a round of applause. Thank you very much, and you have a wonderful day. Let me give back the floor to Rubiat Mohammed, our overall moderator. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for an excellent job, and it's an honor to have you here. Yes, we are now break for lunch, and we'll be back in an hour for the second round of the pre-forum. So for those who are present here, enjoy your lunch, and for colleagues who are joining us online as well, and see you in an hour. Thank you very much.